Mankind was created in the garden to reflect the image of God and thus adhere to the morality and ethics that God had given to him. However, after the events of the fall, man succumbed further into his immoral desires and violent passions, which led to the eventuality that the law of God was to be broken time and time again. As man continued to break God's law and drift further away from the ideals of the garden, sin, conflict, and wickedness became a part of man's character, leading to a conflict between those who sought to follow the law of God and those who sought to break it. Biblical principles preach that thou shalt not kill, and doing so is a sin. However, how does a Christian respond to those who threaten his right to life? How does he practice self-defense while also respecting biblical laws? Killing as an act of violence is inherently wrong, and the immorality of doing so is a basic principle innately instilled in men. However, as more men joined the ranks of evil upon the earth, and the kingdom of darkness expanded its sphere of influence across the face of the earth, those who sought to follow morality and peace were faced with dire threats, which endangered the very values and the morals of Christianity. Hence, the Christian has two weapons of choice in his arsenal. On one hand lies the cross, and on the other hand lies the sword. However, which does he pick? Is a Christian obligated to pick up the sword and conquer his enemies with the sword? Or should he turn his cheek away from conflict, put down the sword, and pick up the cross? If Christians truly believe that biblical guidelines and standards should be applied to every part of their life, why is it that the most basic of the biblical laws is almost completely overlooked when discussing warfare? The Bible is very clear in the 6th commandment about man killing man, stating, "Thou shalt not kill." So, is taking the sword like arming oneself in order to take the life of anyone without the command or permission of a superior or lawful authority in war a sin? Is the Christian to take up arms and meet his enemy on the battlefield, plunge his sword into his enemies, or is he to step aside from conflict and allow his enemies to overcome him? As time progressed, man became more accustomed to war, and as a result, conflicts became more frequent. Furthermore, the violence and destruction caused by warfare became forgotten, and the passions that inclined him to fear death and to value peace grew weak. As man forgets the horrors of war and becomes callous to the shrieks and groans of the wounded who cry aloud, he surrenders his peace, rallies behind a flag, and willingly marches to his own demise. Thus, as man assembles behind the call of patriotism and raises his weapons against his enemies, what is the reason for man turning his weapons against one another? What is it in man's nature that causes an eagerness to kill the other man so readily on the field of battle? Is it the dehumanization of war through technology that no longer requires man to come face to face in combat? Or is it simply the mind disconnecting and numbing itself to the reality that at the opposite end of his weapon is another human? The question behind why men fight has been discussed for thousands of years, spanning from the dialogue between Glaucon, Polemarchus, and Socrates in the Republic, and Hobbes' discussion on the nature of man in the Leviathan. Both authors arrived at similar conclusions, blaming human nature and the lack of common moral grounds among humanity as the root cause of war. However, the link between warfare and man's corrupt nature and his actions was most notably discussed by the author of the Leviathan, Hobbes. He was one of the first to arrive at the conclusion that, without a common power to keep man in awe, he is in a condition which is called war, and such a war is of every man against every man. Thus, as man moves away from the common authority of God, he becomes more accustomed to sin and depravity. Hobbes' suggestion points towards a bleak reality, which is that the cause of war is not because of territory disputes or disagreements between governments, but human nature and the evil men causing conflicts among the nations. Humanity has fallen far from the ideals and the perfection of the Garden of Eden. As man drifted away from the standards that the garden had upheld, he became more accustomed to his own corrupt nature and evil tendencies. The result of this is that nothing can be unjust. The notions of right and wrong, justice and injustice, have no place. Furthermore, As man turned godless and his own passions overtook him, compelling him to go against his reason, the state of man became increasingly immoral. Naturally, man without God easily gives into his evil tendencies and passions, which drives him into conflict, as Socrates illustrates it when he discusses the topic of war. He claims that he will not call war good or evil. However, immediately after that statement, Socrates claims that war's origin is in the body and its desires. Certainly, the first cause of war is not a provocation or a conflict of interest between two countries, but instead is from desires that battle within man. For those who lose to this internal war, they desire but do not have, so they kill. They covet but cannot get what they want, so they quarrel and fight. Now, such an internal war would not exist if the human race had, in the exercise of free will, continued steadfast in the uprightness in which he was created. However, the reality of the world which has been consumed by sin is that mankind is a fallen and broken race, which is the key point in explaining the causes of war. The Bible addresses this point directly and provides possibly the greatest commandment that will lead men away from war, which is to guard your heart and recognize that everything you do flows from it. That commandment was given to bring light as to the importance of protecting the heart from worldly influences and desires. Hence, the war to end all wars does not start on foreign shores or with the weapons of man, but in man's own heart and mind. Each and every individual must fight back against principalities and immorality within his heart. Those who have failed to fight against evil allow immorality to consume their hearts, and as a result, depravity and wickedness causes them to become tyrannical leaders, causing conflict and turmoil throughout the world. Thus, as long as there is sin in the world, man will move further and further away from God's original intent for humanity, and immoral men will rise to power, threatening the nations of the earth. On account of the reality that the conflict of good and evil within man can have a profound effect on the world, how does Christianity respond to the unfortunate prospect of war? His answer to warfare has often contained two spectrums. On one side lie those who wholly reject the idea of warfare and seek to avoid conflict, the pacifists. Then, there are those who justify the means of warfare as a necessary evil required to reach a desired goal. However, if evil can be undone but cannot develop into good, is it logical to fight evil with evil, to fight fire with fire? Is war a necessary evil in order to minimize the effects of these immoral men? One of the answers to the justification for war has led to the belief in pacifism. The ideas and guidelines of pacifism claim to have a strong foundation in biblical values, built around verses like, "Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." Those who adhere to its values claim that war is inconsistent with Christ's law and goes against his Sermon on the Mount. However, even the greatest pacifist of all, Jesus Christ, was not able to avoid violence and conflict, even though his entire lifetime on earth consisted of a non-violent way of life. Therefore, is pacifism actually the best answer to violence and conflict? While its values are noble and just, does it deny the individual of his right to life by denying his ability to defend himself? Jesus gives a clear answer to this by telling his apostles who were about to embark on a journey through an area known to have thieves, "Let him who has no sword sell his mantle and buy one." He did not reject his followers of the basic principle of self-defense, and did not fully deny the use of force with a sword. Therefore, while the pacifist claims that he shall never give in to violence, standing by while another's life is threatened, or a neighbor is slaughtered at the hands of evil is not a virtue. Furthermore, how can the pacifist deny himself of his own right to life and refuse to defend himself? Can those who advocate peace at any cost justify conflict and war? As Thomas Aquinas puts it, those who wage war are threatened by our Lord with punishment, according to Matthew 26:52. All that take the sword shall perish with the sword. Therefore, all wars are unlawful. However, In a world plagued by war, can the pacifist values survive in a world consistently threatened by the evil forces of this earth? Or are Christians supposed to surrender their self-defense and become non-aggressive? The world is wrought with sin, and there exists a separation into those who live by human standards and the other those who live according to God's will. Sinful men and ideologies will rise to power and will threaten the populations of countries, and those who live according to the law of God must be ready to challenge them with equal and opposite force. Furthermore, as long as there is a consistent stream of sinful men, there will always be conflict on earth. The greatest example of this is a conflict between good and evil in history. The greatest example of this conflict between good and evil in history poses a very difficult question for those who call themselves pacifists. If the values of nonviolence and non-aggression had been fully adopted in the past, Christianity would have encountered its assured end. For example, Christianity was faced with a very real threat in the 8th century AD. A new religion swept across the Middle East, with its followers dedicated to conquering in the name of their God. These invaders swiftly moved to take the old Christian lands of the Mideast, North Africa, and the Fertile Crescent. This religion born from the blade was Islam, and its followers sought to establish an empire dubbed the Caliphate, pressing into Eastern and Western Europe with great strength. The leaders who sat in the Christian European capitals, viewing the conflict from a distance, suddenly found the Islamic invaders brutally pressing into Europe. Nearly 1 million slaves were taken in the process, and the invaders had stacked skulls so high in Spain that one could not see over the top while sitting on the back of a horse. The Pope's seat of power and arguably the heart of Christianity, St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, had been sacked and damaged by Muslim invaders. They even came within 100 miles of Paris and laid siege to the city on the river Vienna. Therefore, because threats will face Christianity, responding to these threats is an obligation. Nevertheless, should the pacifists have sacrificed the entire Christian religion, its institutions and values, all in the name of non-aggression? Any logical mind would understand the need for defense just as Jesus did, and understand the necessity for self-defense. Thomas Aquinas lays down the guidelines for the justification behind retaliation, as one that avenges wrongs when a nation or state has to be punished for refusing to make amends for the wrongs inflicted by its subjects, or to restore what it has seized unjustly. Hence, because the threats to the freedom of Christians and pagans alike is so great, pacifism cannot exist in a world that is plagued with evil men that threaten the very values for which it stands, namely non-aggression and the refusal to retaliate when threatened. Just as the time for the kingdom of Christ to be physically established will come, the time for pacifism will also come. The biblical image is laid out for the peace that the pacifist so eagerly seeks, as a time where people will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. The Prince of Peace will usher in the time when the wolf will live with the lamb. Yet, the peace described in the Bible is exactly the error in the reasoning of the pacifist. The ideals that the pacifist attempts to live by cannot yet be imposed due to the fact that humanity does not live by and according to the standards upheld in the Garden of Eden. The world is in a fallen state where immorality drives men to commit heinous acts. Pacifism is a godly mistake, meaning that it seeks to adhere to biblical values, but it fails to take seriously the sinfulness of human nature and fails to address the manifestations of evil in the world. Thus, in some cases, pacifism cannot solve a conflict, and the last resort in eradicating evil is warfare. St. Augustine believed that God designed humanity to live with each other in a bond of peace. However, with the reality that man is no longer in a state of perfection, peace will be broken, and war will erupt in the nations. In consequence of that truth, does man, when protecting himself by killing his aggressors, commit a sin? The Old Testament's teachings provided the Hebrew people with a framework for when slaying was permitted, as mentioned in Exodus. The most notable example of this is when Moses is given rules for the Israelites to live by, which states, if a thief is found breaking in and is beaten to death, no blood guilt is incurred. Here, God instructs Moses that under that circumstance of a robber breaking into a home, he may be killed in defense of one's home. Furthermore, those who act in an unjust manner towards others will be punished for their actions. With the understanding that killing one's attacker as a byproduct of self-defense is a precept of defending one's right to life, it is therefore a good worth performing. As Aquinas claims, nothing hinders one act from having two effects, only one of which is intended. Thus, while murder is a sin, someone being killed as a byproduct of self-defense is not a sin, but a result of protecting one's well-being. Aquinas describes the moral justification behind that act as taking their species according to what is intended, and not according to what is beside their intention. Thus, killing in self-defense is lawful as long as it's done under circumstances that deem it necessary for the defender to do so, in order to protect his life, thereby violating the state of harmony. Accordingly, while self-defense is permitted, the Lord laments the idea of harm being inflicted upon his children in Lamentations, which says, "For he does not willingly bring affliction or grief to the children of men." However, while the Lord does not desire to see his children slain, war was often seen as a holy war in the Old Testament, even initiated by God himself. Thus, if war is not an unjust act, and even practiced within the Bible, what are the guidelines for a just war? St. Thomas Aquinas lays out a set of principles and criteria that are to be met when waging war. First, he claims that there must be a sovereign authority who ordains the war, and secondly, a just cause behind the war, and lastly, the right intentions. Thus, warfare must be permitted by a legitimate authority, and it must have a just cause coupled with the right intentions. Furthermore, the purpose of war is not to provoke, but it is to be waged in order to attain peace. On the other hand, is going to war for peace a contradiction within itself? The intention of force through warfare, by definition, is the opposite of peace. However, while peace is sacrificed for a time, and if the three guidelines as mentioned by Augustine are met, the overall purpose of war is peace. Hence, it should be done only as a necessity, to re-establish peace among the world and with punishing evildoers and of the uplifting of good. Therefore, while the outcome of warfare is unjust, namely the killing of men, the purpose of inflicting war is to oppose the evil forces on earth who wish to disrupt the peace and threaten the populations of earth. To understand man's warlike nature is to understand the events that first took place at the time of man's creation, the Garden of Eden. When man sinned against God for the first time, man's inclination towards morality and goodness evolved into a drive for wickedness and immoral desires. Sin became one with human nature, and each successive generation after Adam and Eve grew farther away from God. Cain and Abel were the first to put into perspective how far man had fallen from God, and humanity's ability to kill his own kind merely because of the conflict of interest. Arguments grew into aggressions, and disagreements turned into conflicts, and nations turned against each other, forgetting the common ancestry and the common humanity of man. This resulted in the world being consumed by warfare and conflict, driven by men who sought after their own desires. Hobbes paved the way for understanding the connection between man's corrupt nature and the conflict he causes, which is understanding the state of man. Human nature, now tainted by sin, has driven man far away from the heavenly ideal of peace, forcing men to fight back against their own evil desires. With the reality of human nature, sin and conflict, many have looked at the result of the just war, which is death and destruction, and have rebuked it, saying there is no such thing as a just war, and that war is antithetical to the gospel. However, they have failed to address the very real need for good to rise up against evil. The pacifist view of war is short-sighted, meaning that while the results of conflict are clear, that is to say death and destruction, the purpose of the just war is not to kill, but to pursue a peaceful tomorrow. Reconciliation among the nations through war is the only way to establish peace for a time. Regretfully, peace can only be established for a time before humanity forgets the conflicts from the past and returns to his old ways, which is the very reason why the pacifist cannot exist in a world that is wrought with sin. War is inevitable and will come to threaten the populations of Earth, and those who rise up to meet this evil face-on are not warmongers, but peacekeepers. Although the Christian should seek peace at any cost when conflicts arise, he's not to stand by as 1,000 died at his left and 10,000 at his right. The greatest societies were formed out of those who are willing to fight what they believe in defense of their homes against aggressors. Furthermore, the ideals of world peace that the pacifists so passionately strive for cannot be realized until sin is completely removed from the world and the weapons permitting man to wage war against each other are laid down. In conclusion, while wars are poor chisels for carving out peaceful tomorrows, there will be one final conflict to end all wars. That conflict is the event revealed in the book of Revelation, in which Jesus will come down from heaven with an army of saints to deter Israel's invaders. However, until that moment, war will continue, and there must be those who rise up with a blade in hand to confront evil face to face.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nunez. I would like to begin with the Martin Luther King. Actually, folks would like to come in. It's a good time to come in if you like. I'd like to get a Martin Luther King quote that you finished up. Very nice little quote. Wars are poor chisels for carving out peaceful tomorrows, not just because it's woodworker imagery, but it seems to get at an important fact. And though your paper seems to argue very well for the legitimacy of war in addressing the evil that exists in the world, what could you say about understanding when war is actually the appropriate tool for addressing evil and when its application may be misguided or actually even harmful? Yeah,
sure. That's actually a topic that sort of my paper would evolve to if it kept on continuing. But the purpose of my paper is to justify, is to find a justification for war, first off. I think going into the next tier of actually saying what are the laws of warfare when an army invades another country or vice versa, I think that's a whole other topic. But just aside from my paper, I think that the justifications for war, it becomes hard to really practice morality during warfare. When the Japanese were spreading out across East Asia. I'm not sure if you guys have heard, but they committed absolutely horrible acts, which was namely the rape of Nanking, which they raped 40,000 women and children, babies included. So, when U.S. soldiers were going across East Asia, it was very hard to sort of contain their, I want to say almost passions, contain their passions, because they had seen the absolute violence that the Japanese had carried out. But I feel like that's a whole other topic to my paper, because that would be actually going into the life of the soldier and determining what was right and wrong in that situation.
All right. I'd like you to elaborate on your comment that you make at the end of one of your paragraphs. You say, therefore, because threats will face Christianity, responding to these threats is an obligation. The assumption behind that comment seems to be that Christianity is a political institution. Wars are able to overthrow nations. Wars will never change the value of 2 + 2, or whether or not Christ is risen from the dead. Now, can you say in what sense a war can in fact in what sense a war can threaten Christianity?
Yeah, sure. So for instance, if an invading army was to take over our country, if you were to sort of fast forward their occupation, like let's say 150 years, they would do something they would sort of change the culture, and they would change the beliefs of that nation in order to benefit themselves. And so, for instance, I brought up, the Moors invading Europe in the 8th century. If the Moors had, taken over Rome, taken over Constantinople, which they eventually did, taking over London, taking over Paris, European culture, which a lot of modern day Christianity spurred from, would have been non-existent. So I would actually agree that while Christianity is not a political institution, Christianity is instilled and sort of woven into our culture. So if our culture, European culture had been taken over, Christianity would have gone with that, because Muslims were absolutely brutal in Europe. They would kill Christians on sight. They would sever their heads. Just absolutely brutal. So if that takeover would have happened, I'm not sure the United States would have looked like what it is today.
Mm-hmm. Yes, there were certainly times in history when the Muslims did kill many Christians. However, people have argued that the growth of the church is watered by the blood of the martyrs, and that martyrdom is part of Christianity, and that we are to endure that with faith. And should we be so concerned about keeping a situation where Christians aren't martyred by the existing political order?
Okay, so sorry, just to repeat your question, are you asking whether or not Christians should be martyrs instead of going to war?
No. Obviously, Christians should be martyrs if necessary. They don't need to try to be. Some do, but we don't need to. However, when faced with that fact, we should be willing to accept it. And given the prevalence of Christian martyrdom throughout church history, and oftentimes the strength of the church in times of martyrdom, do we need to be so concerned about keeping a political order that will not set itself against Christianity? And that seems to be a reason why you argue for Christians not being pacifists, is we need to protect the existing political order and to fight for it so that it is a political order that does not martyr Christians. Yeah,
sure. So like the examples of martyrs in the Bible was the Roman Empire carrying out punishments on Christians. I can think of a few examples, but it would be different if because the Roman Empire eventually became Christian with the arrival of some of the leaders in Rome who changed the face of Rome and made it a Holy Roman Empire. But with the question of martyrs, I think that sort of appeals to the side of pacifism, because martyring in the first place is surrendering your desire to defend yourself and sort of surrendering your right to life. So I think that's a thin veil between. It sort of falls on the pacifist side, but I'm not sure if all Christians were to be instead when aggressors would come onto them, if all Christians were to be martyrs, I don't know if our culture, again going back to my original point, I don't know if our culture would have survived that if everyone had been martyrs. So I'm not sure that Christianity would have even exist.
Okay, so you're saying that a small number of martyrs is good, a large number of martyrs is bad.
Yeah.
All right. I want to ask you, at what point do you say that there's a cutoff there, but I think asking for such a number seems a little unreasonable. All right, let me go to another example, and that is the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was a very disciplined and very strong empire under the Republic, and a number of Roman historians have held the position that it was the defeat of Carthage at the hands of the Romans that ended up resulting in the weakness of the Roman Empire, because their great enemy was gone. And when they had an enemy there, when they had to fight against people who were trying to kill them, that made them strong. It seems some people keep the same idea towards the church, that when Christianity is under attack, we're at our best. And that when Christianity is, you might say, the state religion, that it makes us soft, and that the faithful are not tried as they need to be, and that being that we are kind of, in a sense, living for another world when the political order sets itself against us and kills us, you might say to live is gain, but to die is greater. And so, to paraphrase roughly, is there really an argument for Christians putting a great deal of sacrifice into maintaining political order, and particularly going up and doing something, killing other people, which we are so oftentimes exhorted to not in the Scriptures?
That's a good question. So let me just repeat, just so I know what you're saying. Are you saying if Christians should sort of have a vigor in protecting the political order?
The question is, given the fact that even the Roman Empire was made stronger by having enemies that were constantly attacking them, when we have enemies in the world and Christians' blood is being shed for being Christians, should we not look upon that situation as one that we do not need to be afraid of, but to see as an opportunity for the increase of our faith, and therefore being concerned about going to war, maintaining our Christian political order should not be that big of an emphasis in Christian life?
Yeah, what I think about that is that pacifism can only exist because there are those who are willing to defend the pacifist. So, it's almost like others fight for the pacifist, while the pacifist stays out of war altogether. So if Christianity had adopted that train of thought, I feel like it keeps going back to my, my original point. If Christianity had maintained that train of thought, our culture would have been much different. So, but when in regards to the Christian sort of almost seeking, the life of the martyr, or seeing, threats coming upon them as an opportunity to faith, I do agree with all of that. But there needs to be a point and a line drawn in the sand in which he realizes that if something is not done, his children and maybe his wife will be threatened and maybe killed. So it becomes a question of when do you defend yourself and when do you defend others around you.
All right, thank you very much. Other questions?
Slightly different track, but I just was thinking of one of the earlier paragraphs. You talked about kind of dehumanization of war through technology, and I thought that was a very interesting point, because just watching the news and current events, you kind of see that a lot more. Reading the old books where you have these wars where wars had rules. They were almost a lot more structured, where you had the codes of chivalry at one point. And nowadays it seems like war just has no rules. Like, you do whatever it takes to make sure that you defeat them and are not defeated. So I guess my question is, we talk about kind of doing whatever it takes to defeat evil. Does that cross a line at some point? So I guess should war have rules to it?
Yeah, it's funny that you asked that. After World War II and one, the European countries and the United States sort of agreed on the Geneva Conventions. So we would have a set of laws. However, most of our enemies in the modern day geopolitical realm have not signed the Geneva Convention. So our potential enemies in the world, for instance, like Iran, has threatened the United States almost daily, it seems, and have threatened to destroy Israel. So it becomes hard, because when you turn yourself into almost a moral soldier, right, and your enemy is the complete opposite, it becomes almost a internal set of laws that the soldier has to keep up. Do I shoot a family who has supported a Japanese soldier? That's a difficult question. But yeah, I think before that sort of goes into each and every soldier's set of moral codes and laws and how strong they are.
So you mentioned that war can be justified if it has a just cause, and basically all wars started in order to restore peace again. But isn't pacifism the intention behind it also to restore peace? So couldn't you do either or, if that's the intention?
Yeah, sure. The problem with pacifism is that, in the realm of warfare, the pacifist enjoys peace while warfare does not exist. So, for instance, let's dream up the scenario of the United States having, an enemy that is threatened to land on the West Coast, so like all the major cities. The pacifist could probably continue to live his life like he does. However, like I said before, there are those who will have to fight and die for that pacifist values. And so, in a world of, mankind being sinful, like I mentioned many times in my paper, there will be those, those enemies that come to threaten us and come to, threaten our right to life. And so the pacifist enjoys his peace, but does not fight for it.
Okay, I went to read about the part where you called Jesus Christ the greatest pacifist of all. So can you define first what you meant by pacifist there?
Yeah. So Jesus Christ throughout his lifetime turned down any opportunity to commit violence. Obviously, he wouldn't do that because he's a sinless being. He is the Son of God. But what I mean by that is that in each moment, for instance, when he's in the garden and the soldiers come to confiscate him, Jesus could have easily just a thought, not even a thought, made them disappear and just gone, just like that. So at every opportunity where Jesus could have displayed his power and his wrath, he sort of surrendered that because Jesus had a very clear path that he was supposed to follow, which is to die on the cross for his sins and rise 3 days later. So what I mean by that is that he was a pacifist because he turned down any opportunity to be violent.
So I guess you could argue then, since we're called to try to be like Christ, should we try to be pacifists since that's how Christ lived while he was on this earth? Yeah.
So the thing with that is that it has to be, what I found in the world is that either side of things, if you to one side, you're usually wrong. So it has to be a balance between seeking peace at any cost, diplomatically, but then realizing the very real need to defend yourself through warfare. So it becomes a balance between pacifism and a balance between, the just war theory.
I was wondering about the example of Jesus in the temple clearing out the
Alterations.
Yes, and I was wondering, it seems that he acted quite violently there, so I was wondering what you thought about that.
Yeah, sure. So I'm sure Jesus was clearing out all the merchants because it was forbidden to buy and sell in the temple. So when Jesus did that, he didn't threaten anyone's right to life. He didn't threaten anyone's life. All those people knew the law. They knew that they weren't supposed to buy and sell. So Jesus, when he was carrying that out, yes, I think it calls it a holy anger. Righteous anger, that's right. I think it calls it a righteous anger. So that's actually more of an example of the justification between having a vigor and a sort of zealous attitude towards your moral code. Our moral code, which is ultimately divine.
And then also in the beginning of the paper, you speak of, however, after the events of the fall, man succumbed further into his immoral desires. So if you could clarify your beliefs on how he went in further, because later in the paper, it seems like you say that, man, before the events of the fall was sort of, perfect. So how could he, I was wondering how you could reconcile him succumbing further into death after the events of the fall and also being really perfect for him.
Yeah, sure. So, after the events of the fall, man was exposed to sinful nature. And what I mean by that is that he succumbed further into that is that, as our culture sort of has progressed over thousands and thousands of years, it becomes, for whatever reason, more corrupt and more sinful. That's why there is a flood to wipe off all of the, not remember the word, but to basically, it was a reset because it had just gotten so bad. There was killing daily on the streets, and it became a thing of normalcy. They had been worshiping the idols instead of God. And so what I mean by that is our culture, our culture sort of progresses, unfortunately, towards a more sinful direction. For instance, the legalization of gay marriage or no gender bathrooms, right? So our culture just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. And so at some point there needs to be, a reset. But to go back to the original point of man getting deeper into that, that's just the way our culture, for whatever reason, has progressed over, a few thousand years.
So a main tenet of your paper seems to be the idea that we as Christians specifically can't let innocents die at the hands of the oppressor, right? Well, the United States has taken that position to a degree, and according to a statistic published by the Cato Institute a few years ago, 8 out of 10 times we have done that. We have failed and killed innocent people, and I think you're aware of this fact. So in the real world, because it's nice to talk about, the hypotheticals, but in the real world, when we know that intervention is imperfect, and we know that it, as the statistics show, can sometimes actually kill more people than it helps, how would you reconcile the actual application of your paper in the real world?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. My point wasn't to justify, intervention, which I don't think you're saying. But, for instance, in the United States, I certainly disagree with multiple of our interventions over the past few decades. For instance, let me take an example, for instance, Syria, where we provided moderate rebels with weapons who later gave those weapons to ISIS, and even 1,000 of them that we had spent tons of money on went to ISIS. So I certainly disagree with sort of carrying out these interventions on countries that are in the midst of civil wars. But at which point it becomes justified to be the big brother. That is a hefty political discussion because you have to take into account the cultural beliefs of the country you're going into. For instance, if they believe that women should not be in the military, how are you supposed to deal with that? So you have to look at the culture that you're going into, the political crisis that you're trying to solve. And may I just say also that I do not, multiple times throughout our most recent history with the Defense Department, our interventions have ended up horribly, absolutely horribly. So I most of the time I disagree with the intervening and sort of defending the innocents. Most countries in world history have had their internal conflicts, have fought with each other, but they've been able to progress their culture. They've been able to progress their civilization without other people intervening. A lot of the European countries were like that. England had tons of internal conflict, tons of political change. So for the most part, I disagree with being the big brother and intervening. Yeah.
So with interventions and things like that, it appears that you are perhaps sacrificing the lives of some innocent people in that. But it seems like that in all cases in warfare you have to sacrifice something, and if the interventions can bring about peace, is it okay to actually do that sacrifice if it brings about more and more prolonged peace?
So the point of my paper wasn't to point out intervention, but I will take it that way anyway. Yeah, so for instance, let's take an example. When Saudi Arabia went into Yemen last summer, we provided them with JDAM bombs, which are smart bombs, which hit their target with absolute precision. And in multiple cases, the bombs that we had provided them with, in one case fell on a wedding and killed 100 people. fell on a wedding in Yemen. So just think about how sad that is. So I certainly agree that in some cases, like for instance World War II, the defeat of the Nazis, that was a just intervention. Although innocents may have died, now Europe is a safe place again, and the culture isn't radicalizing more like it was in World War II. So the death of innocents in warfare, that becomes a tricky subject, because then you have to ask, well, how many need to die in order to achieve the greater good? Like I said, I, for the most part, have disagreed with multiple of our interventions, but there's been a few that I think were just, for instance, World War II was justified. But yeah, that becomes a topic of when is it okay to sort of defeat the enemy in another country, and how many innocents is it okay for them to be killed for our cause to be just?
And the Bible says that we're not supposed to murder. And so how would you differentiate between murder and having a war and killing people? Because you're killing people in both cases, but is there a difference, or are they the same?
Yeah, so the point I made in my paper, let me find the quote really quickly. Okay, I'll just try and remember it. But the quote was that, if one cause has an effect that wasn't intended, that becomes justified. For instance, the example of the Old Testament, and how you were allowed to, sort of kill a thief in an act of self-defense. But your question is, is there a difference between murdering in self-defense and murdering in cold blood? Which I give the example of in the beginning, is it is inherently wrong to kill out of an act of violence. So killing out of an act of self-defense, although it has the same results, it has different intentions with both sides.
I want to take a bit more of I want to approach your speaking very prophetically with them. And in part of the group, you talk about what's going to happen about the wolf lying down with the lamb, and the liberty of Israel coming about. And can you just speak more on that? And then, okay, also, what do you think about, do you think the condition that Israel is in currently would be something that would cause intervention that God would have to come about? And of course, maybe talk a little bit. Or do you think it could be something that would come about because of the prophecies in Revelation that it would be final instead of a restart?
Yeah. So the current state of Israel, we provided them with, I believe it was $400 million to build something called the Iron Dome. And the Iron Dome would, it would fire projectiles at missiles coming over the Gaza Strip or from the West Bank. So that is one way we have intervened without actually intervening. So the current state of Israel, they're surrounded by, all the Arab nations who do not want an Israeli state. The biggest being Iran. Saudi Arabia also has supported, multiple acts of violence inside of Israel. And so, but speaking more of Revelation, the point at which Israel seems like it's done, like it's about to be overcome, is when I believe God will come down and push back. And make the clear distinction that in order for peace to be established once again, God brings an army of saints who are going to kill the other enemy armies. So it is not always God acting in a peaceful manner to carry out peace. Sometimes he brings his full force, and he brings, the Lion of Judah, right? A lion is not nice. A lion is vicious and broad, But yeah, so like going back again to the point you made about Revelation, I think that, we could see that in our lifetime, possibly, if Israel becomes overcome, and we could see, the second coming but most importantly, we could see Christ's army of saints.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nunez. All right, we'll take a moment before we get started, so a little bit. Also, Great Books 5 students, I'd like you guys to pick up our microphones. I'd like to make these 2 rows here for Great Books 5 students. You good? Guys, all sit right there. I'll get you all in.
Oh my gosh, I was on your YouTube for a while. Really good. I can appreciate the content because I have to create content myself. I feel like some people don't understand the process.
Sometimes people have to
Yeah. 30 minutes? To do that? I would love to do that to get back to the PTS and what it gives you. Sure. And I can incorporate a couple of melodies, some hymns, coming in and input. Yeah, I could do that. That'd be really fun. One thing I do have to tell you